Good morning, everybody. Congratulations on making it to day 3 of JNUC 2019. As Betty said, this is API 101. This is the building blocks of automation. I'm Chris, and this is John. We are implementation engineers here at Jamf. This session, by the way, if you missed the syllabus at the door, we can download it online later. But this session, if you're looking to expand your general knowledge with the command line, with Jamf, or with APIs in general, we're hoping that you'll be able to take away some information from this session that is immediately useful for you back home in your org. We're going to start from the beginning in this session, from square one. From the top, we'll set off by answering these following questions. What is an API? But how do I use that API? Specifically, does Jamf have APIs? That's cool. So what do we do with it? And finally, you mean we can automate all the things? John?
So yes, you can automate all the things, but first, those building blocks. If I were to do any research, I would go up to Google and I would say, hey Google, I didn't hear anything, good. What is an API? And if I were to see this definition show up on any of my search results, I would immediately close my laptop and throw it out the door, because there's no way on earth I know what I'm going to investigate any further. So in layman's terms, or in human terms, what is an API? TLDR, why point and click when you can automate? A GUI, or a graphical user interface, like the Jamf Pro web app, you go to a URL and you have username, password field, and enter. That's point and click. That involves a keyboard, a mouse, and a human. That also leaves a lot of room for error. How many times have we seen in any live demos ever someone type in their password incorrect, have to hit enter, wrong password, wrong password, wrong password, wrong password, over and over again. Instead, if we type it in once or give a computer those credentials, as long as we don't change that password on the back end, it'll continue to work over and over. So that API allows us to do the same tasks that we could do with a keyboard and mouse, but with a computer, repeatable and in an automated fashion. But first, before you build, you need to know your bricks and mortar. You got to know your terminology. The terminology dealing with any API, not just one that maybe Jamf would make, or Adobe would make, or Microsoft would make, any API uses these same terms. You just will use these terms interchangeably or differently based on your workflow. Authentication. If anyone has ever logged into anything ever, that is authentication. So authentication can be something like a username and password. Or as we go throughout time, needs to be a little more secure, and maybe you would have to have an expired token. So that token could be your authentication. Or we have two-factor authentication. There's many different ways to auth. When interacting with an API, you have to be able to interact with whatever you're looking to interact with, whether it's a web app or another tool or software. You have to have permission to do that. You have to have auth. The term endpoint we may use throughout this presentation, and that's a segment of data or a type of action you may do inside of any kind of application. So an endpoint may be, in Jamf, let's say, computers. The computer's endpoint would give you back computer information. In system settings or Jamf Pro settings, you have departments or categories. If we use the endpoint department or categories, we would then be able to interact with, get, update, or add new categories or departments, so on and so forth. And the endpoints are vast, and every software has different endpoints that they may make. Okta would have something dealing with users, whether you deactivate a user, adding a user, changing users' permissions, elevating them, restricting them. Those individual actions are found on endpoints. Actually doing the thing is called a call or a request. So a call or request is essentially your brain telling your hand to click. Now, what you click on, that's defined later in the API. And then once you do the click of your pointer finger on that mouse, hopefully you get some sort of thing back, whether a correct login, or you got the proper computer record you're looking for, or, if you failed, an error or a permission error. You're not allowed to get in a 404. We all love 404 screens. But that thing that you do, that thing that you click on, the thing that you change or edit, because there's no, yes, there's a computer, yes, there's a keyboard, yes, there's a mouse when dealing with computers, but if you're having a computer do it on its own, it doesn't have arms, legs, or any way to interact with that. So instead, you have to tell it what to do programmatically. And those are called actions. So an action tells the computer what type of process or what thing to execute when using the API. These 4 are not just for Jamf, if Jamf has an API. These 4 are for any API virtually anywhere, at least dealing with web servers. Get. The term get is kind of like what it sounds like. It will allow you to get or retrieve information back from a particular endpoint, and then from there you can do something with that data, whether it's generate a report for finance, determine if that application that you just bought 5,000 licenses of is actually being used, anything along those lines. Get that information, not do anything with it in Jamf or in your application, but make a CSV, say. Post, if those categories or departments I talked about earlier, or buildings inside Jamf Pro service settings don't exist, say you're a company and you bought a new company, and that company has a whole slew of buildings and departments. If you don't have an AD, you can use the API to automatically inject all of those buildings and departments for you, so you don't have to manually type in everyone. And then later, when you do have an LDAP, because you are a human and you typed in the building incorrectly, New York had 2 Ks in it, things don't match up, people don't get the right permissions, and you just locked out your entire New York office from using Wi-Fi. That's bad. If you had a computer do it, you won't be able to make that mistake. Put, if the record exists, you can update it. What does this mean? So if you had, say, one of those buildings and you wanted to change a name, or a particular smart group or static group required a certain number of devices or a certain bit of criteria, and you wanted to adjust that criteria, but not what that smart group is scoped to in a policy or an application, Put would modify that smart group, but not create a new one. It just takes what's already there and changes the information inside of it. And then delete, the scariest one of all. Stay away from delete until you've tested and tested and tested and tested. Some like to be dangerous and test and prod. I'm not one of those people because I enjoy having a career. Test, test, test when using delete. It will, in fact, delete a record, and you won't get a prompt or pop-up that says, "Are you sure you wanted to delete every computer in your Jamf instance?" No, you probably didn't. So putting those pieces together, quick show of hands. Who here is familiar or has used a command line interface like terminal? Okay, we're outnumbered. So you may be familiar with a very long line of text, and for those that are not, do not be intimidated, because the words you see up here, we will not only define, but you will be able to see the differences and be able to link the building blocks together to create your own command and create your own API command. See, it's not that scary. It's so small on the screen. It's fine. We have our request. We define the request as doing the thing, or reaching out to a web server to get some information. We provided curl, we provided the terminal with the authentication. In this case, we created an API user, an API password, that has permissions to do just the one thing that we were looking to do. We provide the computer with our server URL, in this case, company.jamfcloud.com. If you're on-prem, you have an API, and that would be .company.com/:8443 or 443 or whatever you have your server set up to be. The new thing is that endpoint, JSS resource/computers. JSS resource is inside of the web app that allows you to direct your traffic or direct your request to the API to extract data, not through the interface. So this tells the Jamf Pro instance, if there's an API, I still don't know yet, maybe you'll tell me later, tells the Jamf Pro instance to return back information about computers. And that last bit at the end, that tiny, tiny, tiny little part, what actual action are we looking to execute? X, not Wakanda Forever, X is get. So that's going to retrieve information. So let's break it down even further. As I mentioned, curl tells the computer to do the thing. curl is a command, and in this case, we're using bash. So curl has a lot of different variables you can add, or there are a bunch of parameters you can specify. And those parameters in bash, or at least in the command line in this sense, are called flags. We see the flags in orange, and this is just basically a text editor that knows what language we're using, so it can highlight those colors for us. You may not see these colors inside of your terminal, but we have flags S, K, and H. S is silent. So a silent command would return back, instead of a bunch of gobbledygook HTML blobs and all these things, we only want to get back the stuff that we care about. So based on whatever else we put in that command, we're only going to get back that data or that output. Suppresses anything else. K, because we may be not using a Mac that's enrolled in Jamf, we may not have the same server, so we're going to ignore the server certs. H tells us what and how we're going to interact with whatever web app we're doing. So if I'm talking to you right now in English, that would be one particular way of interaction. If I were to talk to you in French, that's a different way of interaction. XML is synonymous with English, and French is synonymous with JSON. Not saying they're French and English words, just saying that they're two different ways to essentially accomplish the same task. You may get back something different. I may respond to you in something different. But when you're interacting with a web app, you want to specify, and the web app has requirements as to what language you can specify or what kind of data you can send and retrieve. So in this case, XML, if those of you are familiar with the plist, looks a little bit like the one on the left. We have our elements, we have our root element, our child elements, and all the sub elements. And then finally, the furthest down in sub element, you'll have your actual values. An XML file, like I said, kind of looks like a plist if you've ever used a plist before, or any of those com.apple.preferences.plist, or whatever it may be. You'll find the values in there. So the computer is going to talk to a web app using one of these two. JSON on the far right is fairly newer. It's kind of a little more robust, whereas this is very linear, very granular. You may have also objects inside of a JSON blob, they call it, or a JSON bit of data that have dictionaries associated. So as opposed to a key value pair, whereas ID 3 name admins Mac Mini, you may have on the far left a dictionary, meaning instead of just name, you may have full-fledged, it would say just departments, and then just a list of departments, not department finance, department architecture, whatever it may be. There's different reasons why you would use each one, but it's based on the web app. So we talked about the request, we talked about how we're going to communicate. Now we have to tell it, hey, I can definitely do the thing I'm looking to do. That is the authentication. In that command, the flag U, any string after that is going to be that authentication. As I mentioned before, plain text, encoded username and password. So both you and the web app can interpret what it is that you're looking to do, what credentials you're looking to pass through and understand that, or token-based authentication. That endpoint, in this case, computers, specifies that segment of data that when you go ahead and reach out, it's only going to give you back that. You don't want to say one command to give me everything in Jamf Pro ever. If you've had Jamf Pro for 10 plus years, your database is gigabytes, and chances are you don't want to download gigabytes of data just to get a serial number of one computer. So that's where endpoints come into play. And then finally, that xget, if you do not specify get, it's going to default to get. So it's not going to delete. You don't have to worry about it just, is it going to delete something? I don't really know what it's going to do. If you don't put get, it is going to delete. So I may have hinted at it, and I may have screwed up the surprise, but Chris, does Jamf have an API?
I don't know, John. Let's see a show of hands. What do you think? Does Jamf have an API? Yes?
Yeah.
Well, trick question. Jamf actually has two APIs. First, we'll talk about our classic API. This is our first API. It's our oldest and most robust. You can access the documentation for the classic API at your Jamf Pro URL/API. As I said, this was our first one, and it is the most robust in that it has the most endpoints. So there's a lot of actions and a lot of information that you can get using the classic API. It utilizes basic authentication. So this is the username and password that Jonathan was mentioning. It can be encoded, so it doesn't have to be in plain text, but it is username and password and not token-based. You can get both data types, JSON and XML, via the classic API. However, if you're looking to change or add information via the classic API, you must do your put and posts in XML only. Other than the classic API, we have the Jamf Pro API. This is the newer API. It has different endpoints than classic. It is, the end goal is for everything that's in classic to also be in Jamf Pro API. This is the API that is being currently updated. Some key differences between it and classic is that it uses token-based authorization, so no username and passwords. You'll be using tokens instead, which can also be encoded. And it doesn't allow, it requires you to send in JSON. I should have corrected that. The Jamf Pro API requires you to use JSON instead of XML. So on this side of the house, you'll be using JSON. In Classic, you can use XML if you prefer. OK, so when we work with the API and perform a GET, this is an example, and this would be from the Classic API, since it's in XML format. This is an example of the data that we would receive. This is computer information for computer ID 3 that Jonathan was looking up earlier. And at a glance, we can see useful and identifiable information about this device. As we look through the tree, we see a name, we see MAC address, we see IP address, serial number, et cetera. This is useful at a glance, but we don't always want to view the big picture, especially if we're working programmatically. This data is great for reporting, but if we wanted to act on a single value within this data, we're going to have to parse it down further. To do that in Bash with XML, you might use a tool called XML-lint. This is built in. It's a great tool for isolating values within an XML data. You can use the XPath flag to specifically call out the path to the element that you're trying to isolate. And if we looked at, well, if I go back a slide, I'll point it out. We're looking for perhaps the name. If we're trying to navigate this document, we would go first to that computer root element that Jonathan mentioned. Then we're in the child element of general below that. And then the key value pair or subchild element of name. So to see this put together, we would use XML-lint, XPath, and that specific path, computer general name. You can add text with parentheses at the end of this command to strip out the XML tags. That would leave us with the result of just the name. This is the full command. If we put it all together, we'll see we're using the curl to get the information. I do want to point out on this example, you wouldn't use the backslashes. In fact, it would be one continuous line. There would be no line breaks, no backslashes. But we're using curl to get the information. And then we're using the pipe to link it with the XML-lint command to parse that information down to isolate a single value. So what if we wanted to find something other than name? Similar concept. If we were looking for serial number, that happens to be in the same child element of general. So the only difference here is that we're looking in the subchild element of serial number. As you might expect, the difference in our command is very subtle. It looks the exact same. The only difference is the word name is replaced with the serial number. And the result is going to be the entirely different element. So, Jonathan, what about Python?
Yeah, so Python is probably scary to a lot of people because it was to me. So when I was dealing with Bash, when I was doing simple API commands, I was using Bash. But I found that I couldn't kind of do a lot with Bash, and it required so much text on the page. And after a while, after I had like a 1,000-page script in Bash, it was just getting a little too cumbersome. So I tried to use a different application, and because Bash doesn't have a programming language, Bash doesn't have a native JSON parser. You can definitely install a third-party one. Python does have a built-in JSON parser. So we can do the same thing that we did in Bash, but in Python. And don't be intimidated, because virtually everything you see on this slide are terms and actual strings that we've used before. If you don't believe me, let's dive a little bit deeper. In Bash, we talked about the curl command. We have the action, curl, and curl is synonymous with requests in Python. So curl is to requests. Curl and request, we see that on the page. We have get. Notice how there's no get in the Bash one. I said by default, if you don't specify get, post, put, delete, it does a get. Get is found in Python, sat right next to requests. Those are similar. We have our URL. We have our URL. We have our username and password. We have our username and password. We have accept application XML. We're talking in XML over here. But in Python, I mentioned we're using JSON, so we have to specify JSON instead of XML. Capiche? Capiche? When we're parsing, this is the main difference. When we're parsing in Bash, we have that XML lint with the flag XPath specifying computer, general, MAC address, text. The formatting of Python is a smidge different, but as long as you know that XML lint XPath is the same as whatever that response is that we talked about, whatever we're retrieving back, we can tell Python to take whatever that information is, throw it into a JSON blob I mentioned earlier, that left-hand or that right-hand side bit of information. And then from that, those object trees, just like we did in Bash, where computer was the root element, general was the sub-element or child element, MAC address was the sub-element, and that's the actual value we wanted to return. In Python, we have computer, general, MAC address. Same result, just two different languages. And we can combine these however we want into scripts. So Bash is a scripting language, whereas Python is a programming language. But don't be afraid when you see Python, because you just saw this. It's not scary.
So
well, that's
John,
cool.
I was going to ask you, are there any examples that you can give us of times that you've had to use the API?
That I've had to use the API. Well, I did just recently have to rename every computer in my Jamf Pro instance to its serial number, because we had some rule that said we must name our computers like we do our PCs. And that is a very long string of name plus department plus OU plus year plus last four digits of the social security number and all these things. And it was a little cumbersome. So we did realize that the serial number is on the bottom of the computer or inside the computer. It's one serial number per computer. So we're going to rename them. So I had to go through and I had to log into the computer. I had to click enter. Then I had to search for the computer. Then I had to make sure I copied the serial number and paste it, hit edit, and then go to the name and hit paste. And then make sure I hit save, because in Jamf Pro, if you don't hit save, you're going to have a bad time. And once I hit save, then I hit done. And I just did that like 1,000 times. And well, now that I know all of this, was there another way to do that? Maybe. So the getting of the name, we did that already. We figured out how to curl and how to parse to get that name. Great, we have the name. Now what can we do with that name? So I need to change the names of the ones that are not serial numbers. That don't look like a serial number. So I need to find that computer name serial number. I do know that because I'm going through every single one of these computers, I can determine what this computer serial number is by the ID. For those that aren't familiar with where to find a Jamf Pro ID or JSS ID, or the ID of the computer record, or record in general, when you go to your URL on the far right, you'll find a ID equals, and then a number. Also, if it's a computer or mobile device, you'll find Jamf Pro ID or JSS ID in the general section of the record itself. You can iterate through these. This isn't advanced scripting, so we're not going to go through loops and things like that, so take it one step at a time. But once we have that ID, we can find more information, not just the name. So we can find, as Chris mentioned earlier, that serial number. I know by plain sight, and so would a computer, that the string or the text admins Mac Mini is not equal to the serial number. The device name adjustment is required. So we talked about get. We talked about retrieving all the information. But that's not automating. That's just reading. So instead of just reading, we want to do something with it. Because we have the computers up there, because I'm not changing, or because I'm not adding a new computer, I just want to change the information that's in that computer record. And that would be put, not post. Had I posted, it would attempt to make a brand new computer with just a serial number as the name, but no UDID, no hard drive, no type of model or anything like that. You're going to have a bad time. You're going to get an error. It's not going to work. So instead, we're going to use put. And as Chris mentioned earlier, ignore the slashes. That's just for formatting on the slide. But this would, in general, be one long line, but we added an additional flag because we're going to be sending data up for it to take into inventory. And that uses the flag D for data. The specified data, because we're using the Jamf Pro Classic API, has to be in XML. So the information that we send up to it is in XML. We have our root element, computer, just like we did in that XML that we got back. We have the child element, general. And then we're specifying the value of the serial number for the computer name. If we hit enter in terminal with this information, we just adjusted that device name to the serial number. Now, if I had a list of all the computers that needed to be adjusted, or finance came back to me and said, we need to change all of these computer names, or if I needed to have, or if I had some sort of list, I could create a script to do what I just did for me instead of doing it programmatically and just adjusting one character at a time. So I can very quickly tell it to find the serial number based on the computer ID. And once I find that serial number, go ahead and update it. And the way you would read this in Bash, just a quick highlight, is the for loop tells you for whatever item or whatever thing inside of the curly brackets, so for 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, 20, 27, do a thing. And that thing is for ID 1, reach out to Jamf, get the serial number, update it using put. For item 3, get the serial number, update the serial number just for item 3. So on and so forth until you hit 27. When you hit 27, oh, happy day, everything is updated properly. So in reality, can you automate all the things? Yeah, you pretty much can. You can automate your entire onboarding process. The moment HR puts in a email address for the new person that's being onboarded, it can automatically hit Google to create that Google account or Azure. I think Jump Cloud or Better Cloud, one of those, allows those functions to happen. It creates all of the user groups, adds them to all the OUs, gives them all the necessary software licenses per whatever department it is, all using APIs. If you're looking to automate something and one of your SaaS offerings or your applications do not have an API, hound on the developers. Hey, make an API. I want to do this thing so I don't have to do this anymore. Be all this monotonous tasks. We learned this earlier this week, earlier this week, Jamf Protect. So Jamf Protect is a way to report back those vulnerabilities, but it'd be really cool to not just report on it, but remediate immediately. To do so, Jamf Protect, in conjunction with Jamf Pro, uses the API to not just get the information into Jamf Pro to read it, but it can, based on smart groups looking for those attributes, go ahead, fix it, and remediate. If you're a school, you can absolutely automate tasks. So some customers have asked us, hey, what if I wanted to add restrictions during school but lift them at the end of school, and then when they get home they can do a little more things, or vice versa, lift all restrictions while they're being supervised, the students, and then lock it down when they're back at home so nothing bad gets on the device. You can do that using the API and timed automations. There are a lot of cool things out in Jamf Nation, on GitHub, or even the Jamf Marketplace that utilize the API. Some of you in this room may have used some of these tools, like the Jamf Migrator. If anyone has migrated from an on-prem server to cloud, or an on-prem to on-prem, or from test to prod, or dev to prod, Jamf Migrator would allow you to choose the individual items you want to migrate, and using the API in the back end, Jamf Migrator can accomplish all those tasks for you in 1% of the time, like 1/100th of the time it would take to do it manually. The MUT, for those of us that have to add extension asset tags into their devices, if you have the CSV of serial number to asset tag, the MUT allows you to input a CSV, hit go, and populate your Jamf Pro server. Jamf Pro Group Scoped, if you want to determine what smart groups or what groups are scoped to what parts in your, what policies and applications and all those things in Jamf, you can find out that information before you make a change so you don't remove or add certain things. Now, I see a lot of phones going up, and that's awesome. We have this all on another link I'm going to give you in a bit, so don't worry about losing it now. But in reality, now that you have all the tools, honestly, what are you waiting for? Just go ahead and start building cool things. Any information and other information that you may need and you may want to learn about Jamf API or any other API, I put it on a page for you, jamf.it/JNUC API 101. This is going to be an ongoing and editing. We're going to edit and maintain just a list of resources because anyone can use the API as long as you have access to the information inside of the application you're looking to use. Automate all the things so you don't have to continue to do those boring things over and over and over again. Have computers do that for you so you can provide that better end user experience for your end users. The official Jamf documents for the API are found on developer.jamf.com. And then I would absolutely check out marketplace.jamf.com for more tools that are already built out for you. So you may find integrations up there with ServiceNow, with, say, Zendesk, or with Azure. Whole slew of integrations that we've already built, Symantec, that you may not have to build yourself. Even better, check marketplace.jamf.com to see if it exists. So with any learning, there's always going to be some sort of path that we take. So we all get our jump start when we first start out with Jamf, or used to. The first API get, when we first get that computer name, I'm in. I know what I'm doing. Now that I have that, I can mass update my asset tags or change all the variables I want. But ultimately, let's get to that code a new employee into existence with webhooks and all these other different cool tools out there. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions that you may have that you may not necessarily feel comfortable coming up to the microphones to ask. But Chris and I are happy to answer questions that you may have. And other than that, thank you.
I have a quick one. So when you were going through the put of updating the endpoint's name to the serial number, so isn't that only updating it in Jamf Pro? How is that enforced down to the endpoint?
Absolutely. So you can set up, once you deploy all of that, you can set up a policy or configuration profile to adapt that. There's two different workflows. If you had done a configuration profile, that would hard root that name so the end user wouldn't be able to go into system preferences and change it. A policy would do a one-time name change, so if down the road the end user is an admin, they can go right back into system preferences and change it. But I leave that up to you as to how you want to do actually push that down to your computers. Great question. You take the next one.
I'll take the next one. I would point out on mobile devices, you would actually change the name via the API command. But on computer devices, you would have an extra step.
So yeah, first off, thanks for the talk. But on the API, the Python side of things, you said request was synonymous with curl.
Yep.
If you want to use request, is that built into Python framework, or is that something you need to import?
So requests is, great question. Requests is a kind of a much simpler way, simpler, what's called module or library that you can interact with an API or make these API or HTTP requests. Another and older and kind of deprecated other module is known as URL lib or URL lib 2. Both of those are fine. URL lib 2 and URL lib are built in. Requests is an add-on, but it's becoming so used that once you install Python, because Python doesn't come on Catalina, chances are it's going to be one of the first things you hit, or a lot of the population is using requests. Thank you.
Okay, all of the examples you gave showed using the classic API with the user and password. How do you actually do these using the token?
Sure. So
So, sure. In the Jamf Pro API, you can request a token. You can do it through the UI. You can also do it via the command line. So you'd need to request your token. The server will authorize you for use of that token for the session, and then you can invalidate the token later.
Okay, so does that token expire every time you use it? Do you have to get a new one every time, or?
You can specify that as you request.
Okay.
So you can specify expiry, and you can actually, or the same thing. So the way you get it is the exact same way. It's just a different endpoint to get that token, and then you can use that token for however long you need it to be. Sure.
Good morning.
Morning.
So can you use this? Well, I'm sure you can use this, but are you able to take like a bulk of data, like onboarding devices that are already added to Jamf and DEP, and then assign them to their correct locations where they should be without having to go and click, 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 using the API?
There are absolutely ways you could do that.
Okay.
So you can do it with the API, but we also added computer and device inventory preload, where if you have those serial numbers, you can open up a CSV or like a XML doc, fill in the necessary criteria or format you want, and upload it. So the moment that computer that's already in there enrolls again, it adapts that new attribute. So you can do it either way.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. Mike Levinek, I made the MUT, and just wanted to, not really a question as much of a call to action, encourage you guys to use this stuff, tinker around with it, play with it. I had a couple people show me some really cool stuff this week that they've made, and this stuff's on GitHub. Get involved, make cool things. It's the power of Jamf and.
Absolutely, and you reminded me. So today, 1:30 to 3:30 upstairs is an interactive lab called the GitHub Gallery. Well, you'll get to do hands-on learning on how to implement some of the tools that I mentioned up here. They all pretty much use the API in some capacity. Mike will actually be presenting as well. And you'll be able to interact in a very close quarter. So it's not going to be like this vast room. You're going to be isolated in little pods that essentially will give you that kind of learning environment that will better allow you to ask questions and do one-on-ones. Like, hold on, what did you just do there? You can ask that. 1:30. Upstairs, I think in the greenway. Don't quote me. Check your app. Yep.
Yeah. So hi. So recently we've been able to enable single sign-on on our JSSs, and can you comment a little bit about how that affects the API in terms of what we need to do to get in if that's enabled, or if anything?
Yeah. Do you want to take this?
Shouldn't affect, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it should not affect your API access just by enabling SSO.
Exactly. So whatever authentication you can go through Okta, you just have to be able to have that username and credentials to log in into Jamf. And the way you can test that is if you go to your SSO, or if you go to your Jamf Pro URL, do / and then I think question mark failover, you can test to see if those credentials will work in the API. But it should be, if you can authenticate through Okta, you can authenticate into the API without any single sign-on interaction. Awesome. One more.
So this summer, I'm planning on moving from Jamf Pro to Jamf School.
Okay.
Is the API identical? So right now I use FileMaker to do all my API updating.
Sure.
Will I have to redo everything for Jamf School, or is it identical to Jamf Pro?
That's a good question. I'm not familiar with it. Are you?
I'm not familiar. I know that it's not identical.
I know when you are doing that migration, you are given either a support or success manager alongside. I would ask them what capabilities and what things we can automate for you to move those over and build in, because I know, yeah, that would be a pain to have to redo all of that ongoing. But I do know that Jamf School does have an API. I'm just unfamiliar with what exactly those are. Thanks. All right. Thank you again, and have a great rest of JNUC.